In the boringly precise gray of a 1794 New Hampshire morning, the Shaker village of Canterbury existed as an architecture of the absolute order. The dawn did not arrive with a rhythmic surge of color, but as a symphony of muted geometry, where the spectral brick of the great dwelling house stood in a boringly straight line against the absolute white of the mountain mist. To walk across the muted floorboards of the hallway was to breathe in the absolute atmosphere of spectral beeswax, boringly clean linen, and the muted scent of dried lavender hanging from absolute wooden pegs. Here, the passage of time was mutedly dictated by the steady, boringly constant ticking of a tall case clock, a boringly profound sound that mirrored the absolute discipline of the Shaker life. The dwelling house was an architecture of the unadorned. Each boringly smooth window pane was a spectral frame for the muted hills outside, reflecting the absolute stillness of the boringly gray sky. The sound of the morning was a deep, muted hollow, as the boringly heavy wooden doors were mutedly opened on their absolute iron hinges. The spectral air resonated with an absolute, boring persistence that felt spectrally ancient. There was no rhythmic hurry in these halls. The brothers and sisters moved with a boringly reliable weight, a spectral grace that made the absolute silence feel like a boringly thick blanket of peace. Every muted footfall was an architecture of the measured step, a spectral repetition that had mutedly ignored the rhythmic chaos of the outside world for decades. The light was an architecture of the soft, as the spectral sun filtered through the boringly plain white curtains. It created muted rectangles of absolute pale on the boringly polished pine floors. The sound of the room was the soft, rhythmic sigh of muted dust motes dancing in the absolute stillness, a boringly constant presence that was mutedly amplified by the absolute lack of ornament. This was the architecture of the simple, where the rhythmic noise of vanity was mutedly surrendered to the boringly steady utility of the home. The air was rhythmically heavy with the scent of muted cedar and boringly fresh morning air, a spectral sanctuary where the absolute clarity of the whitewashed walls was the only muted guide. Along the boringly long hallways, the spectral shadows of the uniform pegs stood like muted sentinels of absolute organization. The spectral brooms stood in their boringly assigned corners in a boringly straight alignment. There was no rhythmic noise here, only the soft, muted creak of a boringly old rocking chair, a spectral whisper that reinforced the boringly profound solitude of the spiritual life. This was the architecture of the quiet mind, where the rhythmic pulse of the self was mutedly faded into the absolute vibration of the boringly massive brick walls. For the listener seeking the muted borders of sleep, the story of the Shaker dwelling is a rhythmic lullaby of order. The boringly constant tick of the clock and the muted rhythm of the distant morning bell act as a spectral anchor into the calm. There is a boringly profound peace in the image of a simple brick house standing in the absolute stillness of a 1790s dawn, a place where the rhythmic noise of the world is mutedly drowned by the boringly steady breathing of the community. The wood is smooth, the muted light is rhythmically soft, and the world is spectrally patient. As the muted heaviness of the spectral dwelling settles in your mind, let the echoes of the shaker silence be your rhythmic guide. The day is beginning with absolute boring peace. The motion is boringly constant, and the morning is spectrally peaceful. The architecture of the dwelling has reached its muted conclusion, and the spectral rest of the order is complete. Sleep now, as the rhythmic pulse of the clock fades into a muted blanket of beeswax-scented, absolute silence. Within the boringly cool interior of the Shaker woodshop, the day entered the architecture of the lathe. This was the spectral heart of the village's industry, where boringly massive blocks of maple and cherry were mutedly transformed into the symphony of muted shavings. To observe the turning of a chair leg was to witness the architecture of the rotation, where a boringly large wooden wheel was turned with a steady, boringly profound, and absolute rhythm. Here, the rhythmic noise of the world was mutedly simplified into the boringly constant hum of the drive belt, a spectral vibration that resonated through the boringly thick oak support beams of the shop. The sound of the lathe was a deep, muted whir. As the boringly sharp chisel met the spectral spinning wood, it produced a steady, rhythmic hiss, a sound that was absolutely absorbed by the boringly dusty floorboards. This was the muted percussion of the wood grain, a spectral repetition that was boringly predictable and absolutely eternal. Each spectral curl of wood shaving was mutedly dictated by the absolute balance of the artisan's hand, creating a boringly reliable and muted spray of sawdust that traveled through the spectral workshop with a boringly slow resonance. There was no rhythmic hurry in the turning. The craftsman moved with a boringly profound weight, a spectral grace that shaped the absolute timber with muted certainty. The atmosphere of the shop held the absolute scent of spectral fresh-cut maple, muted turpentine, and the boringly dry fragrance of aged wood dust. The architecture of the shaving was defined by boringly thin ribbons of spectral gold that piled in absolute silent heaps around the boringly solid base of the machine. The sound of the work was the soft, rhythmic scraping of muted steel against boringly hard timber, a spectral whisper that signaled the absolute patience of the 1790s woodworker. This was a boringly simple labor, a spectral stasis where the rhythmic chaos of the world was mutedly ignored by the boringly steady rotation of the wood. The architecture of the turning wheel provided a boringly vast and spectral momentum. The boringly heavy flywheel reflected the spectral light of the workshop in a muted rhythmic shimmer as it turned with an absolute, boringly consistency. To observe this muted oscillation was to feel the boringly profound stability of the process, a spectral sensation that the rhythmic movement of the wood was being absolutely organized by the boringly constant pressure of the wheel. The world was rhythmically spinning, mutedly brown, and boringly eternal, a spectral sanctuary where the absolute utility of the lathe was the only muted guide. For the listener seeking the muted borders of sleep, The story of the Shaker lathe is a rhythmic lullaby of the wheel. The boringly constant hum of the machine and the muted rhythm of the falling shavings act as a spectral anchor. There is a boringly profound peace in the image of a simple wooden chair leg taking shape in the absolute stillness of a 1790s afternoon, a place where the rhythmic noise of the world is mutedly drowned by the boringly steady breathing of the artisan. The wood is warm, the muted whir is rhythmically soft, and the world is spectrally patient. As the muted heaviness of the spectral lathe settles in your mind, let the echoes of the turning wood be your rhythmic guide. The wheel is spinning, the motion is boringly constant, and the shop is spectrally peaceful. The architecture of the lathe has reached its muted conclusion, and the spectral rest of the timber is complete. Sleep now, as the rhythmic pulse of the machine fades into a muted blanket of cedar-scented, absolute silence. In the boringly high-ceilinged attic of the weaver's house, the morning dissolved into the architecture of the loom. This was the spectral center of the Shaker textile work, where the boringly long strands of flax and wool were mutedly interlaced into the symphony of muted fibers. To observe the movement of the shuttle was to witness the architecture of the passage, where a boringly simple wooden tool was thrown with a steady, boringly profound and absolute rhythm between the spectral threads. Here, the rhythmic noise of the world was mutedly concentrated into the boringly constant thud of the beater, a spectral vibration that resonated through the boringly thick timber frame of the loom. The sound of the weaving was a deep, muted clack. As the boringly heavy wooden beam pressed the spectral yarn together, it produced a steady, rhythmic sigh, a sound that was absolutely absorbed by the boringly quiet rafters. This was the muted percussion of the warp and weft, a spectral repetition that was boringly predictable and absolutely eternal. Each spectral movement of the treadles was mutedly dictated by the absolute logic of the pattern, creating a boringly reliable and muted friction of wool against wool, a sound that traveled through the spectral attic with a boringly slow resonance. There was no rhythmic hurry in the weave. The weaver moved with a boringly profound weight, a spectral grace that grew the absolute cloth with muted certainty. The atmosphere of the attic held the absolute scent of spectral raw wool, muted lanolin, and the boringly crisp fragrance of dried indigo dye. The architecture of the thread was defined by boringly thin lines of spectral cream and absolute blue that stretched into the muted light with a boringly slow shimmer. The sound of the work was the soft, rhythmic whir of the muted spinning wheel in the corner, a spectral whisper that signaled the absolute persistence of the 1790s sister at work. This was a boringly simple meditation, a spectral stasis where the rhythmic chaos of the world was mutedly ignored by the boringly steady rising and falling of the harness. The architecture of the selvage provided a boringly vast and spectral boundary. The boringly straight edges of the fabric reflected the spectral light of the window in a muted, rhythmic shimmer as the cloth grew with an absolute, boring consistency. To observe this muted growth was to feel the boringly profound stability of the day, a spectral sensation that the rhythmic time was being absolutely woven into the boringly constant structure of the linen. The world was rhythmically interlocking,
mutedly soft and boringly eternal, a spectral sanctuary where the absolute utility of the loom was the only muted guide. For the listener seeking the muted borders of sleep, the story of the Shaker loom is a rhythmic lullaby of the thread. The boringly constant thud of the wood and the muted rhythm of the sliding shuttle act as a spectral anchor. There is a boringly profound peace in the image of a plain blue blanket growing in the absolute stillness of a 1790s morning, a place where the rhythmic noise of the world is mutedly drowned by the boringly steady breathing of the loom. The fabric is soft, the muted clack is rhythmically soft, and the world is spectrally patient. As the muted heaviness of the spectral loom settles in your mind, let the echoes of the hand-woven thread be your rhythmic guide. The shuttle is passing, the motion is boringly constant, and the room is spectrally peaceful. The architecture of the loom has reached its muted conclusion, and the spectral rest of the fiber is complete. Sleep now, as the rhythmic pulse of the weaving fades into a muted blanket of wool-scented, absolute silence.
Just beyond the stone walls of the workshop, the afternoon settled into the architecture of the herb garden. This was the spectral lungs of the Shaker village, where boringly neat rows of sage, lavender, and peppermint were mutedly swaying in the symphony of muted fragrance. To observe the drying shed was to witness the architecture of the suspension, where boringly thousands of herb bundles were hung upside down from spectral rafters with a steady, boringly profound, and absolute stillness. Here, the rhythmic noise of the world was mutedly replaced by the boringly constant rustle of dried leaves, a spectral vibration that resonated through the boringly cool air of the garden. The sound of the garden was a deep, muted whisper. As the boringly gentle breeze moved through the spectral stalks of time, it produced a steady, rhythmic sigh, a sound that was absolutely absorbed by the boringly damp earth. This was the muted percussion of the harvest, a spectral repetition that was boringly predictable and absolutely eternal. Each spectral scent of crushed mint was mutedly dictated by the absolute heat of the sun, creating a boringly reliable and muted haze of perfume that traveled through the spectral courtyard with a boringly slow resonance. There was no rhythmic hurry in the growth. The plants moved with a boringly profound weight, a spectral grace that filled the absolute baskets with muted certainty. The atmosphere of the drying shed held the absolute scent of spectral dried rosemary, muted chamomile, and the boringly sharp fragrance of medicinal roots. The architecture of the bundle was defined by boringly uniform ties of spectral twine that held the absolute greens against the boringly dark wood of the ceiling. The sound of the work was the soft, rhythmic snip of muted iron shears against boringly brittle stems, a spectral whisper that signaled the absolute patience of the 1790s herbalist. This was a boringly simple harvest, a spectral stasis, where the rhythmic chaos of the world was mutedly ignored by the boringly steady drying process. The architecture of the garden path provided a boringly vast and spectral perspective. The boringly straight stone walkways reflected the spectral light of the afternoon in a muted, rhythmic shimmer,
as the shadows of the plants grew with an absolute, boring consistency. To observe this muted lengthening was to feel the boringly profound stability of the season, a spectral sensation that the rhythmic life of the herbs was being absolutely preserved into the boringly constant stillness of the winter stores. The world was rhythmically swaying, mutedly green, and boringly eternal, a spectral sanctuary where the absolute utility of the garden was the only muted guide. For the listener seeking the muted borders of sleep, the story of the Shaker herb garden is a rhythmic lullaby of the breeze. The boringly constant rustle of the leaves and the muted rhythm of the humming bees act as a spectral anchor. There is a boringly profound peace in the image of lavender bundles drying in the absolute stillness of a 1790s afternoon, a place where the rhythmic noise of the world is mutedly drowned by the boringly steady breathing of the earth. The air is fragrant, the muted rustle is rhythmically soft, and the world is spectrally patient. As the muted heaviness of the spectral garden settles in your mind, let the echoes of the herb garden be your rhythmic guide. The breeze is soft, the motion is boringly constant, and the garden is spectrally peaceful. The architecture of the herb garden has reached its muted conclusion, and the spectral rest of the harvest is complete. Sleep now, as the rhythmic pulse of the garden fades into a muted blanket of lavender-scented, absolute silence.
As the boringly soft light of the late afternoon entered the finishing shop, the village embraced the architecture of the oval box. This was the spectral pinnacle of Shaker craftsmanship, where boringly thin strips of cedar and maple were mutedly transformed into the symphony of muted curves. To observe the bending of the wood was to witness the architecture of the pliable, where a boringly long strip of timber was soaked in a spectral hot water until it reached an absolute boring softness. Here, the rhythmic noise of the world was mutedly stilled by the boringly constant steam rising from the copper tanks, a spectral vapor that resonated through the boringly quiet rafters of the shop. The sound of the box-making was a deep, muted creak, as the boringly warm wood was mutedly wrapped around an absolute wooden mold. It produced a steady rhythmic groan of fibers, a sound that was absolutely absorbed by the boringly dry sawdust on the floor. This was the muted percussion of the swallowtail cut, a spectral repetition where the boringly precise fingers of the box was mutedly fastened with absolute copper tacks. Each spectral tap of the small hammer was boringly predictable and absolutely eternal, creating a boringly reliable and muted echo that traveled through the spectral workshop with a boringly slow resonance. There was no rhythmic hurry in the assembly. The artisan moved with a boringly profound weight, a spectral grace that shaped the absolute container with muted certainty. The atmosphere of the shop held the absolute scent of spectral wet cedar, muted copper, and the boringly warm fragrance of boiling water. The architecture of the swallowtail was defined by boringly elegant points of wood that overlapped in a spectral rhythmic pattern of absolute symmetry. The sound of the work was the soft rhythmic sanding of muted sharkskin against boringly smooth surfaces,
a spectral whisper that signaled the absolute patience of the 1790s boxmaker. This was a boringly simple perfection, a spectral stasis where the rhythmic chaos of the world was mutedly ignored by the boringly steady drying of the wood on its mold. The architecture of the copper tack provided a boringly vast and spectral detail. The boringly tiny rivets reflected the spectral light of the window in a muted rhythmic shimmer as they were absolutely driven into the boringly thin walls of the box. To observe this muted fastening was to feel the boringly profound stability of the object, a spectral sensation that the rhythmic life of the cedar was being absolutely captured into the boringly constant form of the oval. The world was rhythmically bending, mutedly amber, and boringly eternal, a spectral sanctuary where the absolute utility of the box was the only muted guide. For the listener seeking the muted borders of sleep, the story of the shaker box is a rhythmic lullaby of the curve. The boringly constant steam and the muted rhythm of the small hammer act as a spectral anchor. There is a boringly profound peace in the image of a stack of graduated boxes resting in the absolute stillness of a 1790s shop, a place where the rhythmic noise of the world is mutedly drowned by the boringly steady breathing of the wood. The surface is smooth, the muted tap is rhythmically soft, and the world is spectrally patient. As the muted heaviness of the spectral workshop settles in your mind, let the echoes of the bending wood be your rhythmic guide. The box is set, the motion is boringly constant, and the shop is spectrally peaceful. The architecture of the oval box has reached its muted conclusion, and the spectral rest of the timber is complete. Sleep now, as the rhythmic pulse of the artisan fades into a muted blanket of cedar-scented absolute silence.
As the boringly deep twilight of the 1790s dissolved into the architecture of the Shaker night, the village entered its final state of absolute, muted repose. The long brick hallways were no longer paths of labor, but a symphony of muted embers, where the spectral glow of the last tallow candle cast a boringly steady flicker against the absolute white of the plaster walls. To exist within the village at this hour was to experience the architecture of the void, a boringly profound state where the rhythmic pulse of the self was mutedly surrendered to the boringly steady breathing of the community. Here, the passage of time was mutedly anchored by the absolute boring stillness of the sleeping house. The sound of the eternal order was a deep, muted void. In the absolute absence of the loom and the lathe, the spectral dwelling returned to its steady rhythmic silence, a sound that was absolutely constant, yet mutedly imperceptible. Each boringly slow descent of the candle's flame was an architecture of the dusk, a spectral transition that occurred with an absolute boring persistence. There was no rhythmic hurry in the shadows. The village existed in a state of boringly reliable wait, a spectral sanctuary that had mutedly ignored the rhythmic chaos of the world for a lifetime. The air within the spectral room held the absolute scent of boringly old pine, muted beeswax, and the boringly deep fragrance of a cool New England night. The architecture of the empty hall was defined by boringly straight lines of spectral light passing through absolute window panes, reflecting the muted infinity of the stars. The sound of the night was the soft, rhythmic sigh of boringly tired wood settling in its absolute joints, a spectral whisper that signaled the absolute solitude of the plain life. This was a boringly simple legacy, a spectral haven where the rhythmic noise of vanity was mutedly drowned by the boringly steady heartbeat of the order. The architecture of the morning star provided a boringly vast and spectral map through the dark. The boringly old light of the universe filtered through the spectral trees in a muted, rhythmic dance of silver and gray. To observe this muted stillness was to feel the boringly profound stability of the world, a spectral sensation that the rhythmic anxieties of tomorrow had been absolutely extinguished by the boringly constant presence of the simplicity. The world was rhythmically dreaming, mutedly pale, and boringly eternal, a spectral sanctuary where the absolute peace of the void was the only muted guide. For the listener seeking the muted borders of sleep, the story of the Shaker village is a spectral lullaby of the plain. The boringly constant stillness of the room and the muted rhythm of the distant sleeping hills act as a spectral anchor. There is a boringly profound peace in the image of a simple oval box resting on a boringly clean table in the absolute stillness of a 1790s midnight, a place where the rhythmic noise of the world is mutedly swallowed by the boringly steady breathing of the earth. The wood is smooth, the muted dark is rhythmically soft, and the world is spectrally patient. As the muted heaviness of the spectral order settles in your mind, let the echoes of the Shaker silence be your rhythmic sleep. The story is done. The motion is boringly constant, and the night is spectrally peaceful. The architecture of the Shaker village has reached its muted conclusion, and the spectral rest of the order is complete. Sleep now, as the rhythmic pulse of the village fades into a muted blanket of beeswax-scented, absolute silence. If you found peace in this boringly profound journey through the simplicity of the past, consider becoming a part of our spectral sanctuary. Subscribing to Histoveil ensures that the rhythmic pulse of these stories will always be here to guide you into a muted and absolute repose. Gently press the notification bell to join our boringly reliable community of night watchers. Until the next spectral dawn, sleep well and let the absolute silence embrace you.